August 1, 1944. A column of American Sherman tanks sat idling on a muddy road outside of Avranches, engines rumbling like distant thunder, crews checking ammunition and adjusting periscopes, waiting for orders that would send them into territory no Allied planner fully understood. Behind them, Normandy burned. Smoke from destroyed German positions drifted east on Atlantic winds. Ahead, the maps showed roads, rivers, and forests marked in careful cartographic detail, but they did not show the truth. They did not show the 30,000 men and women who had been waiting in silence for 4 years, memorizing every German patrol route, every bridge capacity, every hidden path through the Breton wilderness. General George S. Patton Jr. stood beside his command vehicle, leather jacket creased from days of continuous movement, staring west into a landscape that would either vindicate his controversial reputation or destroy it completely. He believed in one thing above all else: speed kills doubt. Within 72 hours, he would drive his Third Army deeper into France than any mechanized force in modern history, not because his tanks were invincible, but because an invisible army had already prepared the ground, turning occupied territory into a trap waiting to spring shut. June 1940. France collapsed in 6 weeks, a defeat so stunning that historians would spend decades analyzing how the world's most celebrated army disintegrated. Brittany, the rugged peninsula jutting defiantly into the Atlantic, fell without a single pitched battle. German troops marched into fishing villages and ancient market towns, requisitioning homes, converting schools into administrative barracks, and draping swastikas over stone churches that had stood silent witness to 1,000 years of history. The occupation arrived quietly, methodically, without drama. No grand battles. No heroic last stands worthy of paintings. Just the suffocating silence of surrender, broken only by the rhythmic sound of jackboots on cobblestone streets. But silence is not submission. In cellars beneath farmhouses, in the back rooms of bakeries still warm with morning bread, in the dense forests that had sheltered Celtic rebels, Roman deserters, and medieval outlaws, something began to grow. Farmers who had never held a weapon started watching. School teachers who had taught literature and poetry began passing coded messages written in chalk on walls. Fishermen who knew every inlet, every tide, every hidden cove along the treacherous coast started counting German naval vessels. They were not soldiers. They had no training, no uniforms, no official sanction from any government. They were ordinary people who made an extraordinary choice: resist, survive, and wait for the moment when patience would transform into power. For 4 years, the resistance in Brittany lived double lives that would have broken weaker souls. By day, they obeyed curfews, nodded politely to German soldiers at checkpoints, and kept their heads down, playing the role of defeated citizens. By night, they sabotaged rail lines with carefully placed explosives, hid downed Allied pilots in attics and root cellars, and transmitted intelligence to London using radios hidden behind false walls and buried in barns. Every action carried the crushing weight of death. The Gestapo did not forgive. They did not negotiate. Captured resistors were tortured in basement cells, their screams echoing through stone corridors as interrogators demanded names, addresses, contacts. Entire families vanished overnight for a single intercepted message, loaded onto trucks and never seen again. Yet the networks grew, spreading like roots through frozen ground. They grew because secrecy was currency more valuable than gold, and patience was strategy more powerful than explosives. A blown bridge meant nothing if it triggered mass reprisals that decimated the movement. A dead German soldier meant nothing if it resulted in 10 French hostages executed in the town square as a warning. So they waited. They gathered intelligence on troop movements, recruited carefully among trusted neighbors, and prepared methodically for a day they could not see but refused to stop believing in. By 1943, the signs appeared like cracks in a dam. Allied bombers began hammering the massive ports of Brest and Lorient with increasing intensity, targeting the colossal U-boat pens Hitler had carved into the granite coastline at enormous expense. The resistance watched the contrail streak across grey Atlantic skies and understood, liberation was no longer a desperate dream. It was an operational plan moving forward. British SOE agents and American OSS operatives started arriving by parachute, landing in moonlit fields marked by nervous farmers with flickering torches, their hands shaking as aircraft roared overhead. They brought weapons wrapped in oilcloth, explosives with English instructions, compact radios that could reach London, and most importantly, they brought confirmation that changed everything. The Allies were coming. The invasion was real. The resistance began training in earnest, practicing nighttime ambushes in the forests, learning to blow rail lines with surgical precision that maximized disruption while minimizing reprisals, coordinating operations across regions that had operated independently for years out of necessity. They were building an army without uniforms, without formal ranks, without official recognition from any Allied command structure. An army of ghosts preparing to become real. June 6, 1944. Normandy. The world held its breath as Allied forces stormed 5 beaches under murderous fire, establishing a foothold that would change history. In Brittany, 150 miles to the west, the resistance huddled around illegal radios, listening to BBC broadcasts, decoding activation messages hidden in poetry and classical music. The long sobs of autumn violins. The phrase meant nothing to casual listeners. To the resistance, it meant everything. Activate. Prepare. The moment approaches. German commanders panicked, fearing a second massive invasion on the peninsula, a strategic nightmare that would split their forces. Troops were hastily diverted west. Coastal defenses were reinforced with units stripped from other sectors. Chaos spread through command channels. But the resistance did not rise immediately. Not yet. They had learned the brutal lesson of premature uprisings from Warsaw, from Yugoslavia, from every place where courage without timing meant slaughter. Patience was not cowardice. It was survival, and survival meant being alive when the decisive moment finally arrived. So they watched the skies, waited for confirmation, and tightened the invisible noose in silence, cutting phone lines during midnight raids, sabotaging fuel depots with delayed action devices, mapping every German strongpoint, every ammunition cache, every command post with meticulous care. They were preparing the battlefield for an army they had never met, commanded by a general whose name they did not yet know but whose reputation for speed and aggression would soon become legend. August 1, 1944. Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. took formal command of the newly activated U.S. Third Army in a ceremony that was brief, efficient, and characteristically lacking in sentimentality. He was 58 years old, a cavalryman born in the wrong era, a man who read classical military history in 3 languages and believed himself the reincarnation of ancient warriors. His aggression bordered on recklessness. His profanity was legendary. His mouth had nearly ended his career more than once, most notably when he slapped shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily, an incident that almost cost him everything. But Supreme Commander Eisenhower needed him because Patton understood something other, more cautious commanders did not fully grasp. Modern war was not about methodically holding ground on a map. It was about psychologically shattering the enemy's ability to think, to plan, to respond coherently. Speed, shock, and relentless violence of action. Give them no time to regroup, no space to breathe, no chance to organize a coherent defense or establish fallback positions. Patton looked at the operational map of Brittany spread across his command table and saw opportunity glowing like fire. Allied planners saw a peripheral sideshow, a place to contain stubborn German garrisons while the main effort drove toward Paris and glory. Patton saw a chance to unhinge the entire Western Front, to create chaos so profound that German command structures would collapse under the weight of their own confusion. August 4, Third Army attacked with the fury of a hurricane. Columns of Sherman tanks poured through the narrow Avranches Gap like water through a broken dam, racing west into Brittany at a speed that stunned German commanders and deeply worried American logisticians who understood that armies move on fuel and ammunition. Patton did not wait for supply lines to catch up in neat, orderly fashion. He did not pause to secure his flanks according to doctrine. He did not consolidate positions before pushing forward. He drove relentlessly, trusting with absolute conviction that momentum would compensate for chaos, that speed would create its own security by keeping the enemy perpetually off balance. His tanks roared down roads that did not exist on Allied maps, guided by intelligence that arrived in real time from sources no staff officer had accounted for in their careful planning. Farmers appeared at rural crossroads, pointing directions with rough hands that had guided plows for decades. Messengers on bicycles delivered hastily scrawled notes describing German positions with accuracy no aerial reconnaissance could match. Telephone calls came from village mayors reporting enemy movements, fuel shortages, morale collapses. Patton's bewildered officers realized something astonishing and unprecedented was happening around them. They were not advancing through hostile enemy territory. They were advancing through an active, coordinated rebellion that had been waiting 4 years for precisely this moment, preparing the ground with patience no conventional force could match. The convergence was not planned in a headquarters briefing room. It was not outlined in operational orders or coordination meetings. It was forged in motion, in dust and noise and confusion. Resistance leaders who had operated in dangerous isolation for years suddenly found themselves coordinating with American armored columns whose radios crackled with urgent requests for information. OSS officers embedded with Third Army combat units became impromptu liaisons, passing intelligence from resistance networks directly to Patton's forward command post, bypassing normal channels in the interest of speed. The information was staggering in its tactical detail and strategic value. German patrol schedules down to the minute. Ammunition dump locations marked on hand-drawn maps. Bridge weight capacities calculated by engineers who had built them decades earlier. Minefields marked to the meter by farmers who had watched Germans lay them. The resistance had turned Brittany into a surveilled prison where every guard was watched, every movement noted, every weakness catalogued. Now they were handing the keys directly to Patton's tank commanders, and the results were devastating. For the Germans, it was a waking nightmare that violated every assumption about occupied territory. They were being attacked from directions they believed completely secure. Convoys exploded on roads they had traveled safely for 4 years. Communications failed mysteriously because phone lines had been cut hours earlier by saboteurs who knew exactly which cables carried critical traffic. Fuel depots burned because patient men with homemade explosives had been waiting months for the signal to act. The occupation that had seemed unshakable, backed by the might of the Wehrmacht and the terror of the Gestapo, was collapsing from within. German soldiers who had felt like conquerors now felt like prey, hunted by an invisible enemy that struck without warning and vanished into a hostile population. August 10, Patton's lead tanks reached Nantes, 160 kilometers from the breakthrough point, in less than a week of continuous operations. Entire German divisions were bypassed before they could establish blocking positions, encircled by fast-moving columns, or shattered in brief, violent engagements before they understood what was happening. The speed was unprecedented in military history. Historical comparisons failed utterly. Patton was moving faster than the German blitzkrieg of 1940, faster than any mechanized commander in the age of modern warfare, and he was doing it in unfamiliar terrain he did not fully understand, relying on allies he had never formally coordinated with, trusting information from sources that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The resistance rose openly now, emboldened by the thunder of approaching tanks. Men who had hidden their weapons for 4 years walked confidently into town squares with improvised armbands and captured German rifles. They seized police stations, freed political prisoners from cells, and arrested collaborators who had grown fat on German favors. When American tanks finally arrived, treads clanking on cobblestones, they found towns already under friendly control, German flags torn down and burned, French tricolors flying defiantly from windows and church steeples. The celebrations were genuine and explosive, but they were not spontaneous chaos. They were the result of years of careful planning, executed with precision the moment the sound of American engines grew loud enough to drown out 4 years of accumulated fear. Patton pushed his exhausted officers and crews relentlessly, allowing no pause for rest or reorganization. Do not stop. Do not consolidate. Do not wait for orders from higher headquarters. If you see an opportunity, take it immediately. Aggression wins wars. His command style was controlled chaos by deliberate design, and in Brittany, it worked spectacularly because the resistance provided the one critical asset his maps could not: ground truth in real time. They guided tank columns through dense forests along paths invisible to outsiders, warned of prepared ambushes with detailed information about German positions and strength, identified safe river crossings that engineers would have taken days to survey, and pointed tanks toward German weak points with the confidence of locals who knew every stone. Conventional military doctrine would have required massive reconnaissance efforts, careful preparation of lines of communication, and methodical advances with secure flanks. Patton had none of that traditional structure. What he had was an invisible army that knew every stone wall, every stream ford, every hiding place in the entire region. The partnership was improvised, informal, sometimes chaotic, and stunningly effective in practice. German commanders tried desperately to respond to the crisis, but their orders arrived too late or not at all, lost in a communication system designed for occupation, not fluid combat. Networks designed to control occupied territory were useless against an enemy embedded deeply in the population. Messengers were ambushed on rural roads, their documents captured and sent to American intelligence. Radio stations were sabotaged with precision, their equipment destroyed or transmitters compromised. Regional headquarters lost contact with frontline units, operating blind. Entire battalions found themselves isolated, surrounded by hostile civilians and advancing American armor with no clear instructions, no reinforcements, no hope. Some units tried to retreat east toward Germany, following doctrine. Resistance ambushes cut them apart methodically on narrow forest roads where tanks could not maneuver and infantry had nowhere to hide. Others fell back to the fortified ports, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, believing the massive concrete bunkers and coastal guns would protect them from annihilation. Patton let them go without pursuit. He had no intention of wasting precious weeks battering himself against reinforced fortifications while the road to Germany itself lay open before him. He left minimal containment forces and surged eastward without looking back, trusting completely that the resistance and secondary Allied units would keep the ports isolated and irrelevant. This crucial decision revealed Patton's strategic genius beyond mere tactical aggression. He understood intuitively that victory was not about capturing every objective marked on a planning map. It was about destroying the enemy's organizational capacity to resist effectively. By late August, German forces trapped in Brittany were strategically irrelevant to the larger campaign. Trapped in concrete ports, cut off from reinforcement and resupply, demoralized by defeat and surrounded by a population that despised them with 4 years of accumulated hatred. The interior of the peninsula was liberated and secure, and Third Army was already 200 kilometers further east, racing toward the German frontier and the Rhine. The resistance, once hidden and fragmented, now controlled the countryside openly and completely. They established checkpoints on major roads, guarded critical supply routes against sabotage, and governed liberated towns with provisional administrations. The transformation was total and irreversible. Shadows had become soldiers. Whispers had become commands. 4 years of patience had become decisive action that shaped the course of history. September 1944. Brittany stood transformed beyond recognition. The fortified ports remained under siege, their garrisons isolated and slowly starving, but the heartland was free, genuinely liberated. Resistance fighters walked openly in daylight, no longer hiding their weapons or their identities from anyone. German prisoners were marched through streets where they had once patrolled with absolute impunity, faces downcast, uniforms dirty. Collaborators faced rough justice in town squares, their heads shaved, their crimes shouted for all to hear. Schools reopened with French teachers. Markets resumed trading local goods. Church bells rang freely for the first time in 4 years. Life returned, scarred by occupation but fundamentally unbroken. Patton was already far to the east, his tanks grinding toward the Moselle River and beyond, but the echoes of his lightning passage through Brittany resonated powerfully throughout Allied command structures. He had demonstrated conclusively that speed, calculated audacity, and genuine partnership with local resistance forces could achieve operational results that methodical planning and overwhelming firepower could not match. The liberation of Brittany was not a peripheral sideshow. It was a masterclass in operational synergy between conventional and unconventional forces. Historians would later study the campaign with academic fascination, writing dissertations and conducting symposiums. How did an improvised partnership between a conventional mechanized army and an underground civilian resistance achieve such rapid, decisive success against a well-equipped occupying force? The answer lay in three interrelated factors: timing, trust, and operational necessity. The resistance had survived long enough to matter strategically. Patton had arrived fast enough to exploit their survival before German forces could crush the uprising. Neither force could have succeeded alone. The resistance lacked heavy weapons, armor, artillery, air support. Patton lacked detailed intelligence, local guides, knowledge of terrain, understanding of German positions. Together, they created a devastating force multiplier that shattered German control in a matter of weeks. The German military, trained extensively to fight conventional battles against recognizable enemies, was completely unprepared for an opponent that operated simultaneously on two levels: the visible advance of massed armor and the invisible erosion of their rear areas by a hostile population. For the people of Brittany, the months of August and September 1944 became instant legend, stories told and retold. The moment when American tanks appeared on familiar roads, covered in dust and battle damage. When whispered plans discussed in candlelit cellars became shouted orders in liberated town squares. When neighbors who had lived in constant fear for 4 years stepped into brilliant sunlight as liberators of their own land, armed and victorious. Patton never formally commanded the resistance fighters. He never issued them official orders or attempted to integrate them into his military chain of command. But in operational practice, their coordinated actions shaped the tempo, direction, and ultimate success of his campaign. They were his scouts, his saboteurs, his intelligence network, and his flank security. They were the invisible division that no German commander accounted for in their defensive planning, the ghost army that made Patton's reputation for impossible speed achievable. The human cost of liberation was real and substantial. Resistance fighters fell in desperate ambushes, outgunned but refusing to retreat. Civilians died in savage reprisal killings as German units lashed out in final acts of cruelty. Towns were shelled by artillery firing blindly into the countryside. The scars ran deep through families and communities. But the victory was undeniable and permanent. By October, Brittany's interior was secure, functioning under French administration. The German garrisons trapped uselessly in the coastal ports would surrender in the spring of 1945, long after the war had moved hundreds of miles beyond France's borders toward Berlin itself. The legacy of those crucial weeks endured in memory and in military doctrine. Patton had proven that aggressive maneuver warfare, when intelligently paired with local intelligence and active resistance support, could rewrite the established rules of modern warfare. The resistance had proven that ordinary people, armed primarily with patience, local knowledge, and extraordinary courage, could materially shape the outcome of battles they were never supposed to influence according to conventional military thinking. The story of Patton and the 30,000 is not prominently found in official after-action reports filed by staff officers. It exists in scattered memoirs published decades later, in the fading memories of aging veterans interviewed by historians, in the quiet pride of Breton families who remember vividly the day their grandparents stopped hiding in shadows and started fighting in daylight. It is a story of convergence between radically different forces, of a controversial general who trusted ghosts over maps and an underground movement that survived long enough to become a decisive military factor. Together, they turned Brittany from a fortified German occupation zone into liberated French ground in less than a month, not through overwhelming firepower or technological superiority, but through speed, operational coordination, and the accumulated power of a population that refused absolutely to submit to occupation. August 1, 1944. Patton stood beside his command vehicle, staring west into unknown territory while his staff officers checked maps and worried about supply lines. 72 hours later, his lead tanks were deep in Brittany, guided by allies he had never formally met. 4 weeks later, the entire peninsula was effectively liberated, German forces isolated and irrelevant. 4 years of patient waiting. 4 weeks of violent war. 1 aggressive general who commanded ghosts. 30,000 shadows who became soldiers. And a victory that proved beyond doubt that patience and audacity, when perfectly timed and coordinated, could shatter empires built on fear and force.